A few minutes?
Well, a little while, because once it turns live.
Good afternoon. This is Chuck Sailors. I'm proud to be serving this year as the president of the South Carolina School Board Association. And we want to thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us for today's CARES Act webinar. We have over 350 individuals that have signed up to participate in today's session, which is in addition to the over 300 people that signed up for last week's webinar that was hosted by our staff. Today, we are really excited to have with us some very influential and knowledgeable individuals that will be helping us through this webinar and giving you, we think, would be some really great information. So thank you again for being with us. In addition to having our very own Debbie Elmore, who is the Director of Communications and Policy for the School Board Association, we have with us today John Payne. John is the Deputy State Superintendent of Education, who is over the federal programs, accountability, and school improvement for the state of South Carolina. One of his responsibilities will be the implementation of all related activities connected to the CARES Act. In addition to having John with us today, we have Chip Slavin. Chip works for the National School Board Association and is one of our lead advocates on the Hill, working with members of Congress and our departments with the federal level to make sure that our voice is heard and all of the members of Congress understand our needs when it comes to public education. So we want to thank both John and Chip for taking the time to join us today. They are very knowledgeable in their field, and we believe that this will be an excellent opportunity for you today. Also, as a housekeeping note, please understand that the questions box, which is on the right side of your screen, is for questions that you'd like to post. And please be mindful that today's webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on the School Board Association website. So again, thank you so very much for being with us. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And I'll turn it over now to Debbie Elmore. Debbie?
Thank you, Chuck. It's been a busy morning for Chuck. He's spent a couple of hours as a member of the Accelerate ED.
Did I do that? Okay. I'm so sorry. Apologies. Technical difficulties on my part, but thank you, thank you, Chuck. I too want to say welcome everyone out there. I'm so glad to have so many folks, and we appreciate your participation. Chuck, want to thank him for starting us off today and to let everyone know that he's had kind of a busy morning. He is a member of the Accelerate ED task force, and they had their first meeting this morning. In addition to Chuck, SCSBA past president Kathy Coleman is also chairing that task force. So we feel really proud of the school board representation on that task force, and they have a tough job ahead of them in trying to determine how best schools can reopen. So we are definitely supporting them and just look forward to their work and what they have to say. So again, I'm Debbie Elmore, and I'm serving as moderator for the webinar. And since Chuck took some of my talking points, I'm not going to go over those, but again, about the questions. But the one thing I want to say, please complete any question or send us any comments that you have. We actually had, I think it was 10 questions that were submitted in advance. So we know this is some information that people are really hungry for, and that's a great thing. I do want to say, however, just so everyone will know, that we will get to your questions, but we'd like to wait until both presenters have completed their information, and then we'll come back to those questions on that. So I just wanted to let you all know, for those of you who are typing in questions or comments, we'll get to them, but we're going to wait until the end. And then just again about the webinar being recorded, because we always get questions about that. You can find that on our website, which is SCSBA.org, and we'll have that on our homepage, so you'll be able to get that. So as Chuck mentioned, this follows last week's webinar, in which we heard a not so great outlook on state revenues. We went from what was a record-breaking surplus of revenues to now a picture that looks like, just if we can hold on to the current level, we will be doing good. So today is more rosier, if you will. There's some federal help that's on the way, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to not talk anymore, but we're going to focus on the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. I'm going to turn it over to Chip, who is going to kind of give a broad overview of the federal level and kind of what the advocacy efforts that went underway and getting the CARES Act passed, and then also some issues that are still on the table that we're going to be fighting for. And then after Chip, then John Payne's going to focus in on the state level information. And again, thank you, John, and thank you, Chip. Chip, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you also, Chuck. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you folks in South Carolina today. You're one of my favorite states. I'm a native West Virginian, and like West Virginia, you also have a Charleston, and I always kind of laughed about that with my friends from South Carolina. But I want to say a couple things before I get into my presentation about South Carolina and the excellent leadership that you guys have shown, starting with the immediate past president of NSBA, Beth Branham, who has been a pleasure to work with. And she's, of course, staying very active now as an immediate past president. But I just appreciate everyone in South Carolina. You have a great state staff, and you have great boards. And at NSBA, we really appreciate that. I'll just point out that at the Advocacy Institute, you guys made NSBA look particularly good, because when you did your day on Capitol Hill, you left Senator Graham's office and he ended up tweeting about Wi-Fi and school buses. And I got a phone call from the Federal Communications Commission praising the work that the South Carolina School Boards Association did to get his attention on that issue. So I just feel like it's important to let you guys know that you're well thought of by us in Washington. But I wanted to give you a little perspective. I know John's going to give you a really good overview, hopefully, of the CARES Act and sort of the process that states and districts are going to need to go through to free up that funding going forward, and how you can use it, and sort of what the process is going to be. So I'm going to touch on the CARES Act, but I want to give a little perspective on sort of where we were before COVID started in terms of advocacy, where we are now, and where we're going in the future. So that's what my focus is going to be on today, and I'll try not to talk too long, so we can free up time for John and also for some questions when we both finish up. So starting, at sort of the top line, just to remind everyone that, making public education an important investment has long been NSBA's goal and has long been your goal. We have been working very hard this year in particular, prior to COVID-19, to emphasize that point. It's been very important in our efforts and where we've been going forward. And to give you an idea of where we are, pre-COVID, I wanted to lay out some of the key, these are not all the key issues, but these were the key issues that we thought we had the best chance on getting movement on this year, and that we thought was particularly important. So these were the issues that received primary focus at the Advocacy Institute, which occurred February the 2nd through the 4th. So obviously, working for a strong and accurate census, that has not changed, by the way. And I wanted to make sure that bullet was up there for you, to remind you that while we're all distracted by what's going on right now, that having an accurate census is vitally important for education. It impacts numerous federal programs that will impact your students and your districts. And so as we're talking about the immediate needs, I want to remind you to keep pushing the census in your communities. Obviously, fighting for increased resources and federal support gets back to the slide before this one. It's at the heart of everything we're doing. It's particularly important, though, now with what's happening, that we work on getting better support from the federal government, so that school districts, and one thing in public schools, can be more innovative in some of the work they're providing. And I think we're now seeing a time in which we've had to move online, how important it is that you have good models in place, that you have all the resources in place going forward. The teachers pipeline, recruiting, retaining, and securing great teachers remains a huge priority for us. And, you know, if nothing else, this crisis has emphasized how important teachers are to people. I think teachers are now even more appreciated than they were. And we've been seeing a great movement towards support for teachers in the last year or two. IDEA full funding was one of our focuses, and IDEA, as you're going to hear in a second, remains a vital advocacy goal for NSBA, both obviously in the long term, but also in the short term. And then finally, the last issue, bridging the digital divide, keeping E-rate strong and trying to close the homework gap. That lies at the heart of everything that's going on right now with all of your students receiving their learning, at least temporarily, online. So I wanted to lay that out just to sort of show you where we were before all this. And I also point out that NSBA knew the issues that were important. But now we're really seeing, you know, some particular focus. And also just a little update, since we got started early on in March, some of the things we've been working on obviously have been, you know, once again, working on the physical relief side, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Once again, broadband access, improving internet for student accessibility, flexibility for providing certain services, particularly with students with disabilities, and that gets around IDA flexibility. Early on, we had a lot of questions from school boards about nutrition waivers. I think we've managed to answer most of those for the time being, but that remains an issue that we're paying attention to. And it was a very, very big issue the first 2 to 3 weeks that schools closed their buildings and worked online. And then, of course, we're working in numerous collaboration opportunities with other organizations. And just to give you an idea, I'm not going to rattle them all off, but I have been on 2 different coalition calls today alone on 2 different issues, just to give you an idea. So we're trying to work with our partner organizations when it's appropriate. We have many of the same goals. Sometimes the coalitions are big and broad. Sometimes they're smaller and more narrow, depending on what the issue is. So I just wanted to give you an idea on where our focus has been. Now, as you probably are aware, there have been 3 major pieces of legislation that have passed so far. One of which, the CARES Act, is going to be the focus of much of this discussion. But just as a reminder, the first legislation was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental. It was a relatively small in the big picture, as was the second one, to where we are now, but it was $8.3 billion. It was primarily focused on that initial healthcare response and getting things moving so they could jumpstart that process. The second one, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, was simply trying to help families as the primary goal during this difficult time. It was once again also a relatively smaller package in the big scheme of things, $3.5 billion. And then the big one up to this point, the one that passed several weeks ago, which is COVID Supplemental 3, or the CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. That bill was, as you'll see from the slide, was $2 trillion overall. Education received just a little bit more than $30 billion. Of that $30 billion, 13.5 was directly targeted for K-12 education, public schools, and there was also another $3 billion that went into a governor's emergency fund, education fund, that gives governors some flexibility to spend some additional funds on education issues. So those were the 3 packages that passed. There was also another piece of legislation that passed a week ago that wasn't really in sort of the supplemental realm. It added a little bit of job relief for some of the funds had run out. So when you're hearing about legislation, if you're wondering about that 4th piece and why we're not calling it supplemental 4, it really wasn't a big supplemental package. So, and it didn't really have anything that was particularly impactful for education, but wanted to mention it. Some people have referred to it as 3.5, jokingly. But going forward, you know, COVID Supplemental 4 is the one that we're going to be focused on next. A little bit about the CARES Act, and you're going to hear a lot more about this. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just to let you know, we appreciated, number one, NSBA appreciated getting the funds, obviously. It was a start. In the end, the effort was bipartisan. But in the big scheme of things, it is not nearly enough for what is happening in the schools right now during this obviously unprecedented moment in time. And to give you an example, in the initial asks by NSBA and several other organizations, we asked on the front burner for at least $70 billion, with the understanding that we didn't think that was enough either, but it was a starting point. And we based that original $70 billion request on looking back on previous emergencies in which Congress had to appropriate money through supplementals. The best example being what happened in 2008, and then the legislation that followed in 2009, in which schools received about $77 billion in direct funding. And I would point out that schools weren't closed then. You weren't dealing with the issues that we're dealing now. So that's important to keep in mind for the big picture. So we have a long way to go in going forward. Our flexibility on the next package, number 4, there are 3 main big pieces, and there will be other things underneath it, but they're going to look familiar because 3 of them essentially are what we were already advocating for. But now we're in the short term, we're advocating for them now in a gap to get us through this crisis. So obviously we need more resources. I just told you what we had initially asked for. As you can see, we have now asked for at least $200 billion for K-12 education. And that would break down as $175 billion that would go to the states for education purposes and education purposes only around K-12 public schools. We've asked for $13 billion, once again, as a minimum for IDEA, and we've asked for $12 billion for Title I. And we joined a coalition on that effort with a number of other organizations, and that was the compromise language we were able to come up with. We definitely think it's a great starting point and encourage you all to certainly use that figure going forward. But I would always use the term at least or a minimum, because we likely will need even more down the road. Within that scope, there are 2 specific asks we're also asking Congress to deal with. The first one is once again around the digital divide in learning and keeping E-rates strong and closing the homework gap. Still part of our overall broader effort, but in the short term, we feel this is very important. Now, some of you who get action alerts from NSBA may notice that the amount listed, $4 billion, is double what NSBA has been asking for. And that's because there's been some breaking news on this issue. It really just broke last night and today. But there was legislation that has already been introduced in the House by Representative Ming of New York that NSBA supports, calling on funding to be targeted for the homework gap through the E-rate program. And that initial funding asked for $2 billion. What has changed since then? Essentially a couple things. We've always been nervous that $2 billion wasn't really going to get us through the crisis. And as we've been doing more analysis and hearing from others, we definitely concur with that now. One of the big reasons is when we came up with the initial figure very, very early on, we were looking at dealing with this immediate school year. So what do we do from now until schools were scheduled to close for the year and, in early June in most places? How do we get through that situation? Well, we're now still dealing with that situation, but many states have already announced they're not going to go back into the traditional brick and mortar school at all. And there's now talk of extended summer learning to try and help catch students up throughout the year. So those 2 things have added to that. Not adding on top of that is there's still quite a bit of uncertainty about what we're really going to see happening in the fall. So even assuming that schools open in the fall normally, as we all hope they do, it still may not be exactly the same. There may be reason to, for example, in some regions to continue some social distancing practices. So they may seek to reopen schools, but they may limit how many students are in the building at one time. So you may have students going for 2 or 3 hours, and then another group of students coming in for 2 or 3 hours, and then the rest of the learning time continues to be online. So it could be some type of blended learning situation. We don't know that that's going to happen, but we need to think about that possibility. We also need to think about the possibility that we go back and everyone's completely back to normal as we can be under these circumstances in the fall, but we have a second outbreak, which many health experts are predicting may happen. And so we get into the school year and everything is great through October and part of November. Then it becomes necessary once again to sort of repeat history, and we're back to where we started. So those are some of the reasons why, while we still support the House legislation, we're now asking for a higher increase in that number. And I will tell you that the other part of breaking news around that issue is that the Senate companion legislation, which will look very similar to the House legislation, it's being offered by Senator Markey and several other senators, is going to ask for that $4 billion increase. So as we're negotiating with Congress, and as Congress is negotiating with itself on Supplemental 4, our goal is going to be to get that legislation, that House and Senate legislation enacted, and to get it enacted at a minimum of $4 billion. And we think that will jumpstart what needs to happen. I think down the road, we still may need more funds on broadband. But that's where we are right now. So encourage your members to focus on that number when talking with your members. And just to give a little clarity, the reason why we are asking Congress to directly fund this through the E-rate program, which schools and libraries are already familiar with, and they obviously help fund connections to schools themselves, is that school districts are used to working with E-rate. It can be a complex program sometimes, but it's a known quantity. It already has built-in transparency. It has built-in waste, fraud, and abuse protections. The FCC is well placed to be the lead agency on this issue, and it fits really the overall focus of the Universal Service Fund to better connect America, which is what the E-rate program is actually part of, one of 4 programs. So we think it makes a lot of sense that that's the direction we go. We also, on a separate ask, are urging the Federal Communications Commission right now to take some of the unused or unspent E-rate funds for this year that are available and to divert them immediately into helping connect students at home by providing hotspots, routers, and other devices that can help connect students that either aren't connected now or have poor digital connections now. And we believe that the FCC is absolutely well positioned to do this right now. We believe they have the authority to do it under the original Telecommunications Act of 1996, in which the goal was to connect classrooms. The only thing that has changed is right now, the traditional brick and mortar classroom has moved to an online classroom. Students are still learning in a classroom environment. It's just through their computers. And so that's our strategy around the homework gap right now, or the digital divide in education and learning. And we feel that that issue is impacting everything that's going on right now, which is why you're hearing me spend a little bit of time on it. It also impacts IDEA. And so I want to mention that, just like other students, there are many students with disabilities whose families do not have access or do not have good access. And so it becomes providing a service for a student with disability, which is already difficult under the present circumstances, even that much tougher. But with that, we're taking advantage of this time. While we asked for a minimum of $13 billion for IDEA with a number of other groups, NSBA, for our part, we've been talking with congressional staff from the leadership in both houses and in both political parties, that this is really the time to go ahead and fully fund IDEA right now. And the reason that is we've done some estimates that if full funding was this year, and don't quote me on this, but it could be as much as $39 billion total for education. That would allow districts a lot more flexibility, which is a big issue around IDEA, to do more. So as you're talking with your members, I would continually hit them back on that IDEA full funding issue. There's quite a bit of support for it prior to this. There's bipartisan support, but we need to get appropriators and members of the Ways and Means Committee to fully fund it. And if this current challenge is not the opportunity to do that, I don't know when is. So I wanted to lay that out. Those are sort of our three main areas. We also are continuing to ask Congress to provide some flexibility in moving forward. And so I just wanted you to also realize that we believe in the fall when districts fully get back in, that there may be issues arising around flexibility. So wanted to point that out. And just to wrap up, once again, going forward, both short-term and long-term, please keep focusing on IDEA and the homework gap. And obviously our overall goal around public education, it is absolutely our future. We will continue to work very hard at NSBA on your behalf, serving as we can as your Washington office and working very closely with your state association staffs. So with that, I will stop talking and let John go ahead. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much. Thank you to Chuck and Debbie, Chip as well. We certainly appreciate everyone joining today, and we certainly appreciate our partnership with the South Carolina School Boards Association. Just take a moment of privilege, if I could, to really acknowledge the unparalleled work that has gone on in South Carolina and quite frankly across the nation, but certainly here in South Carolina. The leadership of our State Superintendent of Education, Molly Spearman, the leadership of our school board members, our superintendents, our principals and administrators, especially our teachers, our cafeteria workers, our bus drivers, and certainly parents as we go through this historic event, the likes of which we've never faced. And so, again, it's just been amazing really to see the hard work and the dedication and just the genuine fact that we are South Carolina strong. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the CARES Act and kind of lumping in some other parts and pieces to it. The first thing I'm going to just touch on a little bit are just some federal waivers that South Carolina has received. So right when the pandemic really hit, our state superintendent recognized that our teachers and our parents and our students really needed to focus on learning and continuing educational opportunities as opposed to worrying about the end of the year summative assessments. So we decided to cancel those end of year summative assessments and seek a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education, which we did. I have worked over 20 years in public education and the last 13 of which at the Department in Educational Policy. And I really must say that it's been amazing at the quick turnaround that the U.S. Department of Education has provided to states in reviewing waivers and responding. As a matter of fact, when we submitted our first waiver for our accountability and assessment, I submitted the waiver about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and about an hour and a half later, we got an email response back from the U.S. Department of Education approving and indicated that an official letter would be forthcoming. So I must commend the U.S. Department of Education for a really quick turnaround. So with our accountability and assessment waivers, basically what it means is that we will give no new ratings in the fall. So as you probably know, in South Carolina, we rate our schools on a 100-point scale and give an overall rating from excellent all the way to unsatisfactory. The big part of our accountability system are those summative end-of-year assessments in English language arts and math, science, social studies, as well as growth from year over year within those. So since we did not administer, we recognized that we would not be able to do our ratings. And so we decided to seek that waiver. The South Carolina Education Oversight Committee also supported it, voted on it last week. And so what that means is this upcoming fall, there'll be no new ratings, and schools will retain the same ratings from this past fall of 2019, until currently when we plan to reissue report cards in the fall of 2021. So what that means is if, let's say, a school was rated last fall as good, they will hold that rating until we start issuing report cards or these ratings again. We also will continue school designations. So these are federal designations for our underperforming or lower performing schools around South Carolina that we call comprehensive support and improvement, when it's overall all students kind of at the lower levels, or additional targeted support and improvement, which are our schools that may be doing okay, but they have one or more subgroups that are underperforming. So those designations will continue along with their federal funding, which is always contingent upon us continuing to get funds under the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the also known as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now, just because we're not giving ratings does not mean that we're not going to be publicly reporting. So there will be some information that we will report on report cards, but none of that will be used for ratings. We are working right now to identify and create plans for longer term issues. So we know that there are a number of things that, even if this is just a one-year experience, that are going to have longer term effects. And so while this has been this pandemic and this crisis, one small glimmer is the fact that we are currently underway working with the Education Oversight Committee in conducting a cyclical review of our accountability system. So I think this experience gives us a unique opportunity to really go back to the drawing board as we think about school accountability, where we are now and as we go forward. In addition, we also got some federal funds for expiring federal dollars. So we issued a memo back on April 7th about some flexibilities with that. The federal government, when they give federal grants under the Every Student Succeeds Act or other federal programs, typically give states 27 months to spend those funds. So the money that we gave in July, around July 1st, 2018, districts typically have until September 30th of this upcoming 2020 to obligate and spend all those dollars out. So with these waivers, it allows more time to spend existing funds and gives flexible spending options, such as more professional development options or flexibility under Title IV of the ESSA to school districts. And I'll dive into these just very briefly. So one of the things that districts have is with carryover money of these dollars. So typically under Title I, which is our biggest pot outside of food and nutrition, but it's certainly under the Department of Education, our biggest pot of federal dollars. Typically districts can carry over no more than 15% from one year to the next, but we can give a waiver once every 3 years. So this federal waiver removes that limit on how much Title I funds they can carry over. So if they have more than 15%, they can carry that forward. And this also applies to any district, regardless of whether we've given them a waiver. So that increased flexibility gives them more time to spend these funds. In addition, our programs that were funded in FY19, that again would be July of 2018, all of these programs you're seeing on your screen now, they have at least, or if not more than a year to spend. So all of these funds can be spent through, instead of September 30th, 2020, can be spent through September 30th, 2021. And so those are all of our programs under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so you see our school improvement, our direct services, our basic Title I, our migrant dollars, our English learners dollars, so forth. You'll note that state assessment grants are in bold and italicized. That's because that's not flow-through dollars. That's money that we keep at the department to pay for our statewide assessments required under ESSA. In addition, we have waivers for Title I of the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, as well as Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, which most folks know as the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. So we do have an extra until September 30th of 2021 to spend those. And I've just shared this information again, having that extra year. So what we're in the process of completing right now, and we will be sending out to school districts tomorrow, is a single amendment document that authorizes this extended period, and districts will just need to save this document. Typically with a federal grant, you get For each grant, you get a grant award notification, which is a document that everybody has to sign. Well, as you can imagine, if we had to go and revise grant award documents for every one of those programs, it would be overwhelming to us and certainly to school districts in terms of doing all of the work they needed to do. So we're just working on a streamlined single amendment document that authorizes that extended period. Another federal waiver is with respect to Title IV Part A funds. Typically, districts that get more than $30,000 have to do a needs assessment under Title IV Part A, and so that requirement has been waived. And so they do not have to do a needs assessment for their 1920 funding. They can use the needs assessment that was conducted in, or excuse me, for the new needs assessment, they can use the needs assessment that they had from 1920 without any changes. Also, districts that receive Title IV, typically if they receive more than $30,000, there's certain percentage that must be spent in certain areas. So 20% have to be spent on a well-rounded education, 20% for safe and healthy, to support safe and healthy students, and some funds to be spent on technology. The waiver that we have allow districts to spend any remaining funds on any allowable activities under Title IV, and they don't have to spend across those three areas. So again, just increased flexibility in Title IV and how funds are spent. Typically, with Title IV Part A money, districts cannot spend more than 15% of their funds for technology on infrastructure, so things like devices, equipment, software, platforms, so on and so forth. This waiver removes the limit on how much all districts can spend, regardless of whether or not they are above or below that $30,000. So districts can use their funds to buy a lot of technology. And again, as we think about the digital divide and the needs that we have, I think this flexibility will be beneficial to our districts. And another waiver that we had is with respect to the ESSA or ESEA's definition of professional development. Typically, when you're looking at professional development under the title programs, it must be, among other things, sustained, intensive, and collaborative. So typically what we think of is some kind of longer thread of professional development that's scaled up to build skills and expertise. The waiver allows districts to use their ESSA funds to support shorter term professional development that's otherwise allowable under the relevant program. So for example, if districts wanted to do a shorter term, how do you sanitize or make sure you keep a classroom clean? Or how do you provide remote learning opportunities that may be shorter in nature? This waiver allows them now to do that with their title funds. We know that we have all kinds of students in our classroom, including those that are English learners. At this point, the U.S. Department of Education has not provided any guidance, flexibility, or information, but we did take a look because we do want to make sure all of our students, including those that are newly enrolling English learners, have access. So I just point this memo out where we provided some recommendations to school districts on what do you do if you have a potential English learner enroll in your school during this experience. Typically what happens is when a student who is a potential English learner enrolls, the district completes with the parent and student a home language survey. Well, we can do that over the phone or online. Also, the district typically conducts a screener to determine what's the level of language proficiency or English language proficiency of this student so as to develop services. And so what our guidance does is to try to give a workaround, quite frankly, to how districts can make sure that these students are continuing to get services if they enroll during school during these massive statewide school closures. We have lots of questions about special education, and I certainly very much appreciate Chip's comments about fully funding IDEA, because we know that is certainly an issue. We have dedicated a special website related to COVID-19 and special education, and you see the link on the screen before you. And we have prioritized basically our top three. First and foremost is the health and safety needs of our students come first. We want to make sure that we're addressing their mental health and their physical health needs, that is priority. Second is access to learning, to make sure that student needs come before the IDEA compliance in terms of making sure that districts provide reasonable and practical access to continued learning opportunities in light of this experience. And last but certainly not least of all is stakeholder communication, really communicating with parents, families, teachers, and staff on how can we best support students during this experience. We know that in our current setup, that not all services may be able to be provided. So we're working and thinking through a framework about how we can look at some summer opportunities, again, following guidance from our State Department of Health and Environmental Control and the CDC to supplement and provide services for students with disabilities, and how that looks going into next school year. But I do encourage you to take a look at our information and resources on our special education COVID-19 webpage for up-to-date information with respect to that. I will say just a word about IDEA. At this point, you saw all of the federal programs for which we in school districts have an extra year. At this point, IDEA does not have that waiver. So the money that we awarded in July 2018 still must be spent by this upcoming September 30th, 2020. There is not for IDEA an extra year added to it at this point. I'll now turn to some comments about what we've already been talking about more deeply, which is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. As Chip said, it provides $30.75 billion to states for education-related expenses through an education stabilization fund, a little over $13 billion for K-12 education. As Chip said, it was signed into law on March the 27th. And our state education application became available on April 23rd. The governor's application came out on April the 14th. It's important to underscore that these are emergency relief funds. These are not economic stimulus money. And so the intent really is to use these funds to address the current and urgent needs of our students, teachers, and our schools around South Carolina. We also know that the supplement not supplant provision that's typically tied to federal dollars does not apply to the CARES Act funds, but other provisions and regulations do. So as we dive deeper in there, under the CARES Act, South Carolina, our Department of Education is queued up to receive $216,311,158 under something now called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, or ESSER funds. We have one more acronym to add to our vocabulary. Of that $216 million, 10% can be set aside for state reserve activities, which is a little over $21 million. And those state level activities must address the emergency needs related to COVID-19 pandemic. The vast majority, 90%, which is almost $195 million, will flow through to school districts as sub-grants. The governor's office is also slated to receive a little over $48 million on the governor, or under the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Funds, or GEAR funds as it's called. And I'll just take a slide just to talk a little bit more about the governor's funds. The governor's office must apply for the funds, and we've been working closely with Governor McMaster's office and his staff. Those funds must support one or more of the following, which could include sub-grants for the ongoing functionality of our school districts that are significantly impacted by COVID-19, sub-grants to institutes of higher education, our colleges and universities that are impacted by COVID-19, or support to any other college, university, school district, education-related entity within the state that is essential for carrying out these emergency educational services. And that could include provision of childcare and early childhood education, social and emotional support, which we know is key, as well as the protection of education-related jobs. So our ESSER funds, our CARES Act ESSER funds, again, that's the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds, the $216 million. As I said, the federal application came out on April 23rd, and on yesterday, the Department of Education submitted our application to the United States Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education has said that they will work towards a 3 business day turnaround to approve state applications. So yesterday was Wednesday, so we hope by the weekend, or certainly perhaps by Monday at the latest, we will get back our approved application. We have created a website dedicated specifically to the CARES Act and our ESSER funds, and you see that link before you. I encourage you to visit that. We will be continuing to add information to it. As part of that, we have finalized district allocations. So there is a link on that web page that provides by district the allocation that each district is slated to receive. We are, again, as I said, waiting on our approval of our application, and once approved, we will finalize our applications for districts to complete, and then that will be followed by their sub-grant awards. So with respect to our state reserve, that's the 10% or the 21 or so million dollars that we will be holding at the state. We can use those funds for sub-grants or subcontract for statewide needs or activities related to or caused by COVID-19. Now, it's really important as we get all of these monies to make sure that we're maximizing the use of funds and not duplicating what other entities may be spending. So we are working very closely with the governor's office, particularly related to technology. We have sent out a survey to school districts on their IT and distance and remote learning needs, and trying to put it all together to determine how best we can spend our 10% of these ESSER funds. As was mentioned a little earlier, State Superintendent Spearman has convened a group called Accelerate Ed, and several of the folks from the South Carolina School Boards Association are part of that conversation, and really looking at recommendations from them as well on how we can best spend this money to meet our needs. Really, again, thinking about how can we leverage these state dollars to get the biggest bang for the buck that maybe we could buy cheaper for all districts, or we could do cheaper when we're buying or doing something kind of in bulk, if you will. So we completed our application, and so it had all the cover sheets and the reporting assurances and other assurances that we did have to provide the U.S. Department of Education a brief narrative on what we're kind of looking at for as far as a district or an LEA, a subgrant application, and the extent to which funds will be used for technology access and remote learning. So we did complete all of those assurances. Within 60 days of us getting our money, we have to submit a budget for our state funds, that 10%, as well as a description of our internal controls and our subrecipient monitoring plans. With all federal dollars, you have to have a plan to monitor to make sure that those I's get dotted and T's get crossed. And as we think about that, what we're really emphasizing is a streamlined, reduced burden kind of experience, because we don't want districts to have to deal with a bunch of extra bureaucracy. We really want it to be streamlined, so we're really hoping to be able to do a lot of that via desk monitoring. We had to, as part of our application, assure that technical assistance will be provided to school districts on the use of funds for remote learning, and that we also had to ensure that district applications included something called a GEPA statement, which is just really making sure that we're addressing barriers that impede equal access to or participation in sub-grant funded activities. So as far as school district subgrants, the amount that each school district received was in proportion to the amount they received under their most recent Title I Part A subgrant. So let's say, for example, that a school district, when we looked at our Title I applications from last summer, the total amount of flow through that we had, school district A got 3% of those dollars. Subsequently, then that school district would get 3% of these ESSER funds. But what's important to underscore is that while we use Title I Part A, that proportion to calculate it, these money are not solely for Title I schools or students in poverty. These are for the school district to determine. The only part that Title I comes into is just how we calculated the district subgrant amount. The district subgrants also will require equitable participation of non-public schools. In other words, making sure that school districts are consulting with private school within their jurisdiction, to give that equitable participation and those equitable services. And school districts must, and this is the language from the application in law, to the greatest extent practicable, continue to pay district employees and contractors during the period of any closures. So now let me talk just a minute about the 12 areas, or the 12 buckets I've been calling them. These are 12 allowable, or 12 areas of allowable uses. How can districts spend their money? Well, the first way that they can spend their money is any activity authorized under ESSA, IDEA, the Adult Education Family Literacy Act, Perkins, or Part B of the McKinney-Vento, which is our Homeless Assistance Act. So any activity under those federal programs, you can use these federal dollars to pay for. These funds can also be used by districts to coordinate their emergency response efforts. They can be used to address the needs of highly vulnerable populations of children. So children who are homeless, or children with disabilities, children who are in foster care, children who are in residential treatment facilities. So really those vulnerable populations of children. They can be used to support school leaders and school needs. They can be used to ensure preparedness and coordination of both their systems as well as their procedures. They can be used for training related to infectious diseases. These funds can be used to purchase cleaning supplies to sanitize and clean the schools. They can be used for planning and coordination for long-term closures, for education to continue, education technology, mental health support, summer learning, or other activities to ensure the continuity of education and employment. So very broad areas that districts can spend their funds on within these 12 kind of buckets. The detailed descriptions of each of these are online at this link that you see before you now, that really copies and pastes really from the law these 12 areas of allowable uses. And so I do encourage you, as you look through and understand this, to look at that specific wording. So with respect to the district application, how the districts will get this? Well, we do have to do an application that is required, and it will include the typical district information, name of the district, that sort of thing. It will ask districts to kind of look at the budgets by each of those 12 allowable uses and write a short description, a few sentences. This is not about a needs assessment. This is about something short and brief about how activities are planned. We recognize that districts may not know at this point how they're going to spend the full allotment of the money. And so we're going to have recommendations for how districts should budget that information within the application. We're required to have a short description by districts of how the needs were determined. So in thinking about those 12 buckets, how did you determine which you spent your money for? And again, few sentences. We're not looking for long narrative here because we do want this to be streamlined. A general proposed timeline, again, underscoring streamline, nothing, we're not looking for, really lots of detail here because we want this to be streamlined. How funds will be used to address learning gaps and the extent to which funds will be used to support remote learning. So those will be the components as we see right now with respect to the district application. We're hoping to make this a web-based, cloud-based application that districts can complete, maybe attach a couple of PDF fillable documents to, just to really streamline this, but not a lot of paperwork. And we're really hoping to the degree possible to have minimal burden to districts as they budget and apply for these funds. So once applied, we will have those applications reviewed very quickly and a response back, and districts will receive a grant award notification. It'll have the typical terms, conditions, and assurances. And districts will use GAPS, which is our grants accounting process system, which is our internet-based accounting system for their budgets and payment. We will be providing information forthcoming. What we're looking at right now is the degree to which we could advance money. Typically, as you probably know, or some of you may know, with federal dollars, it's a reimbursement basis, but there may be instances where districts just don't have the money to spend first to get reimbursed by federal dollars later. So we're really looking at what opportunities we can have through the system to advance money, but we will be providing more information about that soon. Districts will have certain reporting requirements to the department, and we must then turn around and report to the U.S. Department of Education, and we'll be providing more information about that. I anticipate that's going to be, how much are you spending and which of these buckets are you spending it on? And last but not least, but we will be required to monitor the use of the funds. Again, we're really hoping to have a desk monitoring, building on what systems and processes that we already have, and not add extra burden to school districts in this monitoring requirement. For example, we're going to see within GAP system what kind of reports we might be able to run, and then subsequently not have to ask districts to provide that if we can get it otherwise through GAPs. So some general observations about these ESSER funds that we know is that, first of all, pre-award expenses may be paid for on and after March 13th. That's the date that the president signed this emergency declaration. So if school districts have incurred expenses that can be related to or caused by COVID-19 all the way back to March 13th and after, they can use these CARES Act dollars to basically reimburse for those expenditures. We will have until at least September 30th of 2021 to spend. We believe that we will have an additional 1-year carryover, but that's to be determined. We're waiting to get our federal award, but certainly we will have until September 30th, and we anticipate, I feel pretty sure that they will have a 1-year carryover to go into the September of 2022. As with all funds under federal requirements, the expenses must meet the requirements that they're reasonable, that they're allowable, and they're allocable. And so that's just one of the requirements with any federal funds, including these ESSER dollars. These funds cannot be used on bonuses, merit pay, or similar expenditures unless related to disruptions or closures related to COVID-19. They can't be used to subsidize or offset executive salaries and benefits of individuals who are not school district employees, or expenditures related to state or local teacher, faculty unions, or associations. And again, as we've said, these are emergency relief monies, not stimulus money. So the expectation really is to meet those urgent current existing needs of our students, and as we go into the summer and get queued up to start school in the fall. So how are we going to manage all of this? We have developed a 3-phase management plan that we are currently implementing. Right now, we're in the planning stage where we're putting all of these parts and pieces together. That will then be followed by an awarding and a rollout of the funds, and that will then be followed by a monitoring and reporting phase to this work. We have interdivisional teams from across the Department of Education meeting on multiple calls weekly as we look to how we can simplify forms, procedures, processes for this application, the grant awards, and those kinds of things to make sure that we're moving as swiftly as possible. It's also important, as we're moving as swiftly as possible, to underscore that we want to make sure, though, that we're protecting school districts and the state in terms of making sure we're doing a good job with this and a right job with that. But we are really working hard to get all of these parts and pieces in place and rolled out just as quickly as possible. And I know I went through that very quickly, but that kind of concludes my comments that I had about the CARES Act. And I think we may have just a couple of minutes for some questions. So with that, I guess, Debbie, perhaps I'm turning it back to you.
Okay. Turn back on there. There. Okay. Thank you, John. That was extremely informative. I was going through the questions that we had received in advance. And I think you've answered a lot of them. Just kind of one of them, though, do you want to just something on my Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, you can't see me? Okay. Okay, all right, good. This is what happens on live TV. All right, so thank you, John. I was thanking you for an excellent, excellent presentation, a lot of information, a lot of the pre-questions. I was going through them as you were talking, and you answered a lot of them. I mean, most of these you have answered. So maybe just want to clarify again, I think some of the ones repeating questions were, do you have an idea of when the money would start flowing back to the district? And you covered that, but in terms of a time frame, maybe? I can't hear what he's saying. I can't hear what he's saying.
He's muted.
Sorry about that. Great question, Debbie. And so as typical with all federal dollars, we can't award federal dollars first until we get the federal dollars awarded to the state. So that's the first part, is we have to wait on getting that back. I'm actually following this meeting with a meeting with our core team, as I'm calling them, to look over the application and really figure out what are the remaining parts and pieces that we have to put in place to get that application completed. So I hope if we can get something, if we get our approval back by, say, Monday, and work, spend the rest of next week, I'm hoping within the next couple of weeks that those district applications and grant awards will be handling that. Again, it's going to depend on how quickly the U.S. Department of Education turns around our application, and then hopefully just our ability to just get everything in place so that when we roll it out, we don't have to go back and change anything.
Also, I do have a question I wanted to ask you. The money that can be retained at the State Department, I think you said was 10%, that you all can use to either provide subgrants to districts or to do something in response to COVID-19, I guess at the state level. And it's great that you're working with the governor's office so that we're not duplicating, as you said. The question, though, that I was thinking about was, if districts have already gone ahead, I'll just use an example. Say it's determined that we'll use the state money to ensure that we have plenty of masks and hand sanitizers for every school. We'll just say that. Meanwhile, a school district has bought masks and hand sanitizers for each school. How, I guess, and you might say it's just not going to be possible. How do we create those duplications,
Absolutely. And we, on Tuesday, we talked to superintendents. Yesterday, I talked to instructional leaders. Today, I'm talking to everyone, the school board members and others that are on this call. And that's a great thing. I mean, will there be instances where people maybe already have done those things? Probably. But again, what we really want is to try to minimize. What we're really looking at is with our state dollars, is how can we support, looking at the need for, and this was discussed in the Accelerate Ed meeting, perhaps we can use a portion or some of these monies to help fit in with a learning management system. How can we use some of these funds to help school districts clean and sanitize if they haven't done so, or getting that information? But that's absolutely right with this. Since this is emergency relief money, how do we coordinate all of that, all those parts and pieces, so that we are, to the degree possible, minimizing the districts are spending on it, we're spending on it, the governor, because we don't want that. We won't, because this money will go a lot further if we can coordinate. So communication is just going to be critical.
That's true. So I'm glad. Thank you for pointing that out, because I think that's going to be key as well. So there's another question that's come in. I apologize. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Can funds be used for personnel? Example, social workers for case management?
Yes, so you certainly can. What we're telling schools, we're telling, and we're going through this, is one, really look at being able to justify this as caused by, related to COVID-19, because this is really about, these are emergency funds related to this pandemic that has sent all of our lives into What we would caution districts is using this for some expenditure that they typically have always been having and they've paid for. But if it's justifiable and fit into those, so one of those is mental health supports. And so we recognize as we think about the whole child, and this is true not just for the students, this is true for the teachers and faculty, that we're going to have we have the need to provide social emotional support for services. So with that, absolutely. In terms of personnel, absolutely. That's what, in talking with some other states, really what they're looking at using their funds for, some summer learning opportunities, maybe some funds for when school starts back, particularly given we don't know yet what that's really going to look like. And that's really part of what the recommendations will be coming from Accelerate Ed. So personnel can be used. Now, these are federal dollars. And so with federal dollars, that typically means they have to do a certification on time and effort. And so we just want to make sure that folks are aware of that, but they certainly can be used for personnel. They can be used for mental health supports and social emotional wellness. And again, they just need to make sure that we're just linking it to, it's because of this COVID-19 pandemic that's really the key point to make.
Well, that is good. It does seem like listening to you that there does seem to be a lot of flexibility, more so than there usually is, when it comes to federal funds.
That's right.
Especially the not supplanting supplement issue. So that is good. Appreciate it also that you shared about the waivers for Title I funds. Which is separate then, that allocation district is separate then from this CARES Act.
That's correct.
So you could potentially, since it seems to be a good waiver, you could potentially combine any carry forward Title I funds to make a larger purchase. I don't know, some technology kind of purchases as well.
Absolutely.
And
we would certainly encourage that. I mean, we sent a memo out here. It's been a week or so ago, and I should have included, well, I think it was included in one of those, just encourage districts, now that we got this 1-year waiver especially, to think about revising their budget. So for example, sometimes school districts use their Title I money for, and I'm just going to make this up off the cuff, but say they're using their Title I money for a end of the school year educational field, or where they take a trip to, say, come to the State House to see government in action. Well, with this closure, they couldn't do that. So what we're really wanting districts to do is revise those budgets. You got extra time, you got more flexibility. Look and see how you can braid and blend it with the money that you'll be getting under these ESSER funds, and then just continue listening to what state superintendent, what's coming out of Accelerate Ed, and how we might use these state dollars to really see how all this can work together for a bigger purpose.
So for school board members, I mean, that might be something that you, maybe not right this minute, obviously, but that might be something that you could ask your districts, where are we on that, and how are we utilizing those funds when you reach that point of being able to do that. But it's good information to have, and as school board members, that would be something, since you oversee the budget, or approve the budget. I don't want to say oversee it, but you approve the budget, that would be a good question for board members as well. All right, and Becky's got another question, and I apologize. I had to move to another device. I do not see the questions. And so Becky is helping me out over here, and we have another one. I think this other one here, though, you talked about one is the districts be required to file claims for the allocation. And I think you kind of covered that where you said you're trying to streamline that and make it pretty simple, and I'm not sure, maybe claims is something else, but how do you, that's how it's worded.
Yeah, so typically what happens with federal dollars is that districts get a grant award, and then they go into what we call, again, our GAP system, and they budget.
Okay.
They budget how they're going to spend it by function code and object code. And then, however often, sometimes quarterly, sometimes more frequently, they'll go in and file basically claims or reimbursement requests to, let's say they spent for that quarter, they spent $50,000, they can go in and file a claim. And then our system, which is connected basically to our enterprise system, the checkbook, as I affectionately call it, will then cut those payments to it. And it's typically with federal dollars reimbursement through claims. What we're trying to do is to see, do we have the ability, one, knowing that that funds can be paid for going back all the way to March 13th, making those claims to get those paid for. But as we think about that, because if you're paying back something that you've already spent out from another pot, and now it's freed up this other pot of money, what do you do with that, right? So if you're paying it, and again, don't know that this would be the case, but if they paid, for example, for some expense that they paid for out of Title I money, well, now they got more Title I money to spend, so that might add to their budget a little bit to revise. So just to be thoughtful about that. We're also seeing the degree to which we might work within the system rather than reimbursement, that we may be able, they can go in and file a claim for expenses on an advance. In other words, we're going to spend it just to get some of that money flowing to them, rather than, because we know in some of these instances, districts may not have the general fund to do some of these activities. So they don't have, in other words, they might not have the ability to go out and spend something to turn around and get reimbursed. So can we advance some of this money? So we are exploring all of those options, but our hope is to try to get those out just as quickly as possible. Just because we know districts need the money.
Those two questions. Okay. All right. So is June 5th deadline for amendments for Title I?
So no, so we are being very flexible with those dates. We are encouraging districts to really look at that, since the carry forward doesn't apply. We've got the extra year. We're really looking to streamline those Title I. Earlier this week, we did send out projections for Title I for this upcoming year. But as far as budget revisions, send those as you can, and we can go from there. You did bring up one thing I thought about, Debbie, with your comment, though, that I want to point out is we're also looking at the degree of flexibility that we can give under these title programs. So really, districts should submit a budget request or a budget amendment if it's changing, how they're spending the money. So, for example, if a district said, well, had planned to say, we're going to use Dr. Smith to do some professional development face-to-face with teachers over a 6-week period, and they couldn't do it. But now we're instead going to use Dr. Jones to provide some one-shot, professional development on remote learning, and it doesn't change the budget, then no amendments needed. So they don't have to submit anything, only if it changes. So if instead of using Dr. Smith, we're going to buy Chromebooks, that's when they would need to do an amendment. So just really looking at what flexibility we have with all those amendments.
Well, that would make sense. That would make sense. Absolutely. So this one, since revenue may drop, I guess I'm assuming state revenue may drop next year, is it possible to use these funds to pay existing teachers that are currently in the general fund?
Yes, I think so. I mean, and that's what a lot of states are looking at doing, particularly for expenses incurred going forward. Let me get a little bit more detail on that just to be sure, Debbie, but I'm pretty sure that it can use these for those funds.
Okay. All right. Well, we will make sure when we hear from you and get that word, but that's a good question. All right. I think this is the final question. I know we're way over time, but you're so good, John. And gosh, we got to thank you so much for all this time and expertise. All right. So for fiscal year 19, Title III has a waiver extended time, extra year to spend, but thought I heard that English learners funds does not have extended year. Is that right?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So Title III funds do have an extra year to spend, or until September 30th. Some of the funds, so for example, McKinney-Vento, typically those funds have to be spent in our budget, the way we have our grant awards to districts, by June 30th. All these programs now on that slide that were listed have until September 30th of 2021 to obligate and spend. They don't have to take that long, so if they spend it, so be it, but they all have until September 30th of 2021 to spend. And that would include Title III.
Would that include funding for English language learners?
Yes, that's Title III of the ESSA.
So it would be, okay, because that was, okay. All right, this one here, I think I can answer. Can a school district use funding for equipment, materials, and supplies Absolutely. I mean, yeah, he said that. Yes, you can. I mean, I think it probably has to be related to obviously COVID in some way, but yes, it seems to be very flexible. Well, John, thank you again. I am not sure what happened to Chip. If he is, I apologize. I don't know. But I want to thank Chip as well. But thank you, John, and thanks to all of you out there. Again, this webinar is recorded. It'll be on our website, and I hope you found it as useful and informative as we did. John and Chip, thank you so much, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.